The year is 1890. Thomas Edison, the inventor of the light bulb, amongst other things, has sent employees to the home of Alfred Lord Tennyson. Using cutting-edge technology, that's a phonograph and wax cylinders, they record the 81-year-old poet laureate reading one of the world's most famous poems, The Charge of the Light Brigade. Theirs not to make reply, theirs not to reason why, theirs but to do and die. Into the valley of death rode the 600. There's a huge statue of the poet just outside Lincoln's cathedral, because he was born here in Lincolnshire. But who was the man who inspired this huge ornate statue, and why was his work so influential? In this special programme commemorating 125 years since his death on October the 6th in 1892, we'll learn about him growing up with an ill-tempered father.
He would have rages, and it got progressively worse. And, there were stories of him drinking and so on and being quite violent.
We'll learn about the celebrity culture which swirled around the man and his work.
Tennyson memorabilia was very, very popular because obviously he was a Victorian superstar. He was right up there with Dickens at the time.
And an academic compares him to a very modern phenomenon.
I think it's like Harry Potter in a way, because, it's something that's famous not just for what it is, but the scale with which it's actually being received.
You'll hear some music by a modern composer inspired by the poet's work.
Poems need to be performed. It's not a reading thing. You need to hear it out loud, both being read, but also with the music as well.
And I'll be trying a musical experiment of my own. Lincolnshire rapper O.D. takes Tennyson's lyrics for a trip over a modern hip-hop beat.
I'm sure he'd never think that his poetry would be on a grime beat. I mean, if he was to rise from the dead now...
I wonder what he'd think.
Yeah, I wonder what he'd think.
I'm Harry Parkhill, and this is Tennyson's County. So here I am in the bedroom I grew up in the corner. You've got the desk I did homework, or at least some homework, on as a youngster. If I climb on my bed, there's an old suitcase that I keep relics from my school days in. Here it is. Poetry Anthology for Unit 1 and Unit 3. The very first poet was Alfred Lord Tennyson. And here's his first poem, The Lotus Eaters and Choric Song. I remember as a teenager reading this specific poem and thinking, I like this idea. Death is the end of life. Ah, why should life all labour be? Let us alone. Time driveth onward fast, and in a little while our lips are dumb. Let us alone. What is it that will last? All things are taken from us and become portions and parcels of the dreadful past. Let us alone. What pleasure can we have to war with evil? Is there any peace in ever climbing up the climbing wave? All things have rest and ripen toward the grave. In silence ripen, fall and cease. Give us long rest or death, dark death or dreamful ease. I particularly like the line, should life all labour be? Yes, I thought that. Do we always have to work? I remember that as a youngster doing my homework. I was amazed when I first discovered that Tennyson was from Lincolnshire. But Tennyson was born here, in Somersby in the Lincolnshire Wolds, on August the 6th, 1809. As a young boy, he grew up surrounded by this beautiful countryside of the Wolds, and he was always inspired to write, particularly about Arthurian legends, and actually wrote about them for his whole life. One of his most famous poems was The Lady of Shalott, all about Lancelot and Camelot. He loved reading books in his father's library as well, and was writing well before he had any sort of normal education. His first poems were published at the age of just 18 years old. So when I was studying his poems, he was already publishing them. He later went to Cambridge and won success in a poetry competition with the help of a newly made close friend, Arthur Hallam. But where happiness came in young Alfred's life, tragedy wasn't far behind. His friend Arthur died far too young and plunged the young poet into despair. It was this which inspired Tennyson to write his most celebrated work, In Memoriam, dedicated to his friend Arthur Hallam. It's from this epic poem that we take the immortal lines that you may not even know are Tennyson's. "'Tis better to have loved and lost than to have never loved at all." From writing in memoriam, he went from success to success with collections of poems including his most famous Ulysses and The Lady of Shalott. And after the death of William Wordsworth, he became Queen Victoria's poet laureate, writing famous pieces like The Charge of the Light Brigade as part of his job. Fame came to him whether he liked it or not. Early newspapers obsessed with him, and photography helped make his a familiar face. But it was here in Lincolnshire that it all began, and the Tennyson Birthplace Society still celebrates this fact. I've been to meet one of its members, Debbie Jenner, who showed me around the village of this great poet's birth.
After you.
So you can see already there's a big board that I suspect that might have information on, am I right?
That's the station board. It used to be in the church and we've moved outside.
So yes, we see History Matters on the trail of Alfred Lord Tennyson, Poet Laureate, 1809, 1892. 3 big boards of information. And I believe somewhere in the graveyard,
Yes, it's the tomb of his father.
the tomb of his...
George Gleason. We can go this way.
So if we talk a little bit about Tennyson's early life, it would have been, I suppose, revolving around this quite small church, really.
Yes. Well, his father became the rector here and at Bag Enderby. I think he was quite a reluctant vicar, really. But the thing is, you have to imagine a very learned man, well-educated man, in this village where everyone was illiterate and spoke dialect. So his sermons were very short. And he used to, hop over to Bag Enderby over there for a quarter of a mile away. He was also rector there. But no, there are tales of Alfred running over here, hiding behind gravestones when his father was in a bit of a rage. And all the children were baptised in the church here, or christened in the church. And it's quite a connection with the church, yes. It's very sweet. It's a very tiny church.
I was going to say, because quite a stubby little, lengthwise, there's only, but I suppose, in a village of, 12 houses?
Exactly. Well, I think it's a reflection of probably the wealth, or the lack of wealth, of the landowner. Yes, it's a squat little, twee little church. It's very sweet. Yeah. Do you want to have a look inside?
Yeah, of course.
Okay, let's go in. It's very nice. We've also got a statue, or a bust here, or a copy of a bust. Yeah, so we were lucky to have it restored 3 or 4 years ago now. That's a copy of a bust done by Woolner, who was a big friend of Tennyson's, that was donated, I think, on the 100th anniversary of his death.
And we've got you're selling tea towels and mugs.
Yes.
With guess whose face on it?
Yes, of course.
It's Tennyson.
It's Alfred.
And let's just have a look. We've got a book here because I wonder how many people and where they're from.
There's some from Australia here.
I see the Mornington, Melbourne, Australia. I did pay for the mug, says John. Tell me about Tennyson's father, because we've already touched on the fact that he's had Alfred Tennyson had a mixed upbringing, let's put it that way. You mentioned his father was a bit of a drunk.
Well, he gets bad press. I'm quite... I fight his corner a little bit. George Clayton Tennyson, so Alfred's father, was actually the eldest of 2 brothers. His father, another George, just to complicate matters, was quite well off. He was a lawyer in the Caister area, and he had quite a lot of money. But he made the second son, so George Clayton's brother, the heir, because he didn't really like George, so Alfred's father. So here you have this young man who was quite ambitious, first of all being passed over by his younger brother for the heirship, or whatever you call it, and then being lumbered with being a vicar, a rector in tiny little villages where everyone's illiterate. So I think he was a bit frustrated, to be perfectly honest. There's this rumour of black blood within the Tennyson family. He was epileptic, which was seen frowned upon. There was a bad stigma associated with that.
Yeah, people thought it was something to do with sexually transmitted diseases.
Exactly. And he probably would have been bipolar or schizophrenic. We don't know, obviously, because he's long gone. But he would have rages, and it got progressively worse. And, there are stories of him drinking and so on and being quite violent. So I think it was born of frustration, but also probably genetically there may have been something wrong there. But he did still love his father very much, and also loved being here. So it wasn't as though he had a sad upbringing. It was just very dramatic, I think.
Dramatic, and that was then followed by a tragedy with closest friend dying who he'd made friends with at Cambridge University, and he died as well. So you can see already that this kind of, like you say, dramatic younger part of his life, in his early years, must have shaped the writing and shaped the sort of the drama of his poetry.
It really devastated him, and it inspired him to write In Memoriam, which is one of his most famous poems and very long. But he started that here. It didn't actually get published till much later. But yes, he had a very dramatic life. When you look at his life from beginning to end, he had a long life, and he went from a very pastoral, sweet upbringing here, without, with the exception of his father having his odd rage and so on, to becoming poet laureate and having to live through the Industrial Revolution, which I don't think he really liked. And the world changed, and he was suddenly thrust into the limelight as well. He became a very famous person.
He was almost the first celebrity in the modern sense of the term. Yes. People assumed that the days of Instagram, the days of TVs and magazines began this, but it really did begin properly at the birth of photography and Tennyson.
Yeah, exactly. He'd have people peering in the windows at his house in the Isle of Wight. It drove him nuts. He didn't like it at all. Dickens was a great friend of his. Dickens actually named one of his sons after him. And there's a story of Alfred turning up to Dickens' funeral, but because they actually looked very similar, and because Tennyson was there, people were paying more attention to him than they were to the fact that Charles Dickens had just died. And so he left early because he thought it so disrespectful. Basically, I think he was a very quiet man and missed here, really, the quietness and the tranquility of here.
We'll be returning to Somersby again during the programme. After all, much of Tennyson's life was there. But of course, the work itself is still inspiring people today. Later on, we'll hear a rapper from Lincolnshire interpreting Tennyson's writing in a hip-hop style. But first, in September, Lincoln Cathedral hosted an evening called Celebrating Tennyson. I went along to hear the haunting melodies inspired by the poet's work. Picture the gorgeous setting of the cathedral's chapter house. It's an almost circular room with stained glass windows on every side. Below the windows there are beautiful paintings of all shapes and sizes by the cathedral's artist-in-residence. But we're not here to marvel at the artwork or the fabulous setting. We're here to listen to this. It's music inspired by the work of Alfred Lord Tennyson, who's immortalised as a bronze statue just outside the cathedral. 125 years after his death, Tennyson's poetry is being reinterpreted by a group of musicians and a poet. Much of the music is the handiwork of Robert Stedman, a local composer. He says he wanted to reimagine some of Tennyson's work.
Students today still study Tennyson. My son, he did Tennyson last year in his school, and he really wanted to come along and find out a bit more about Tennyson. And it's he's sufficiently inspired. I mean, he's a teenage lad. The idea is he's really interested in poetry as a result of a Tennyson poem. I think it's fantastic. And what we've done is we've taken the Tennyson poetry and tried to sort of reimagine some of it. So some of it in the concert has been just recited. Some of it will be recited with accompanying music with it, and some of it set as songs, so that it's actually taking it and putting it, doing a crossover into another artistic field, really.
As a school student, I was the same. I found Tennyson to be the only poet that I enjoyed, and I know that's kind of mean to all the others, but it's genuinely true. And for example, my favourite, Charge of the Light Brigade. There's something kind of bombastic and really genuinely inspiring and mythological about his poems.
Oh, absolutely. And I think the imagery is absolutely fantastic. I mean, Charge of the Light Brigade as a lad, I think is a great one. There was lots of stuff I didn't know, and during this process, I mean, Hannah and I had an evening back last November, and it's taken 10 months together, and it was, we ought to do Tennyson, and we could come up with 3 or 4 poems we were sure were definitely by him, and then gradually finding out these others, and I found this one, and I think I could set that as a tune, or I could set that as a song or whatever, and it's been great for us to learn about things and learn about some of these other poems that we didn't know, and there is definitely a sort of a musicality to it. It's not just rhymes and rhymes and rhymes. There's a sort of a thread and a shape to it that seems to lend itself really well to song and to accompaniment with music.
I was going to say that actually because I dug out my A-level anthology and read some of them again, and I found that I had to read them out loud because there's a rhythm and you get lost in the rhythm. Particularly, I know you're featuring The Lady of Shalott, which is...
Their poems need to be performed. It's not a reading thing. You need to hear it out loud.
Yeah.
And I'm hoping that that's what we've done in the concert, of bringing them alive, both being read but also with the music as well, to make sure that it actually is giving a new depth to it.
Many songs, but never one so gay, for he sings of what the world will be when the year...
Also involved is Steve Court, a Lincolnshire poet and actor who performs poetry as part of educational workshops as well as writing his own work. Perhaps the art of poetry has changed little in 125 years, or maybe methods which proved so successful for Tennyson have trickled through generations of poets, because Steve says his research into Tennyson revealed some uncanny similarities with how he works.
I ride a motorbike, so I tend to go around and I get a lot of ideas come to me when I'm halfway down the A46 with no physical way of being able to stop and write them down. So a lot of the stuff that I do is quite rhythmical, it is quite rhythm-based, it is sort of a lot of use of rhyme. So meter's quite a strong thing for me. And the more I've researched Tennyson, he'd go out on, especially when he lived in the Isle of Wight, he'd go out on sort of hilltop walks, and that's where he'd come up with lines. Again, he wouldn't write them down, he'd just play with the way words and things sounded. So again, he was working with this idea of meter and rhythm and assonance, and it's just a really interesting thing to think that all those years ago someone is effectively repeating what we're still doing today. And I think it has changed the things that I've chosen to write about. I never really wrote personal poetry. Mine was more sort of social commentary, so I suppose drawing parallels to Charge of the Light Brigade, whereas now I'm a little bit more introspective. I'm thinking a little bit more about how I see the world through my eyes and how I feel about things. Yeah, his personal stuff is where, and especially now you've researched and you understand the man himself, he exists significantly more in memoriam for Arthur Hallam is just an incredible piece of work to read anyway. But once you know the story behind it, it's just heartfelt and really, a really emotional thing to kind of experience now.
I've teased you with the background music of the concert, but here is one of the pieces of music performed at Celebrating Tennyson here at Lincoln Cathedral. That was Tennyson's poem Crossing the Bar, as interpreted by composer Robert Stedman. It was sung by Hannah Borrell, who came up with the idea for the concert, and accompanied by Ruth Burkitt on the violin and Mark Perkins on the piano. Still to come on this special programme celebrating the life of Alfred Lord Tennyson 125 years after he died. I take a stroll down to a brook in Lincolnshire that Tennyson was inspired to write a poem about. We'll also find out which part of Tennyson his wife wanted to cut off. And we'll hear a Lincolnshire rapper interpret Tennyson's writing in a 21st century style. I'm Harry Parkhill and you're listening to Tennyson's County, a special programme celebrating the life and enduring impact of poet Alfred Lord Tennyson. We've already touched a little bit on the phenomenon which surrounded Tennyson during his life. You could say he was the first person to experience celebrity culture in the way we know it now. Considering that, I suppose it's no surprise that there's an entire archive of material dedicated to the poet. And with his birthplace only down the road, it makes sense for the archive to be here in Lincoln. I've been to visit and to speak to Adrian Wilkinson from the archive about some of the incredible artefacts held there.
I suppose the most important things are probably the things in the case, like Tennyson's pipes and the locks of his hair.
Let's go and have a look then. So we'll just head over here to the glass cabinet here. These actual physical artefacts of the man. So he must have had dark brown hair.
Yes, he appears to have dark brown hair, and of course he's got his dark brown beard, and there's a piece of his beard there as well. But his wife actually didn't like the beard very much. In fact, she wished that an Act of Parliament would be passed for it to be cut off, actually. So.
I wish the public could compel Alfred, by Act of Parliament, to cut off his beard.
That's right, yeah. She wasn't a big fan, but she had to suffer it right to the end, I'm afraid. So.
Talking of the end, we have some quite macabre things gathered in this cabinet as well.
That's right. There's the handkerchief that was placed over his face after he died, and the little skull cap as well, which was placed on his head when he breathed his last too. So.
And also a thermometer
A thermometer and, yes, a little medicine glass as well, which were used in his final illness.
And these are such unusual things to keep, but I suppose that they're kind of indicative of the fact that he was such a celebrity.
Yes, I think it indicates his celebrity status. They're almost like relics, of a saint or of a famous person. And Tennyson memorabilia was very, very popular because obviously he was a Victorian superstar. He was right up there with Dickens at the time.
He was a very elderly man, certainly by the
Victorian standards. Yes, in his early 80s. I mean, life expectancy at that time's early 50s for a man, so he's had 30 years extra over a lot of people of the day. So, yeah, it's a long life. It's
a long life indeed, and of course an illustrious career that went with it. And because of that, if we wander over this way, I mean, just to describe the room, it's basically a library with hundreds, if not thousands, of tomes and artefacts dedicated to the life of Alfred Lord Tennyson. Some of his work, his father's library from Somersby, and also some biographies and criticism of him. But just to go back to the train of thought, he became such a celebrity by the time he died that here we've got some fantastic pieces of artwork about his death.
Yes, that's right. There's loads of paintings and engravings actually showing Tennyson's death and Tennyson's funeral. This one here actually by Forestier actually shows him on his deathbed with figures from Arthurian legend crowding into the room. It sort of looks a bit sort of Wagnerian, I suppose.
Funny enough, it's in the Illustrated London News, which was invented by Herbert Ingram from down the road in Boston. But this was a major piece of artwork, really. I mean, it's probably the Lady of Shalott there, and with maybe even people creeping from the background who are like Ulysses and people who are also mentioned. But scroll along here as well, we've got the Daily Graphic, an illustrated newspaper, which is an absolutely gorgeously designed newspaper. And the front page news of the day on Wednesday, October the 12th, 1892, was the Poet Laureate's resting place being dug out.
Yes, that's right. Yes, he was buried in Poets' Corner in Westminster Abbey. So, yeah, among the finest writers in the land, really. He's right next to Robert Browning, his friend and contemporary. So.
And just around the corner, there are people like Handel, Dickens, and he's overshadowed by Chaucer. So, I mean, this, I guess, in a way, this contextualises just how big a name he was. He's an incredibly influential poet, and yet somehow not everyone really knows his name.
No, I think the problem is that long Victorian narrative poems are not so popular as they once were. They're quite demanding in terms of concentration. And obviously, although the Charge of the Light Brigade has endured, a lot of his other works haven't in the same way.
Again, if we move around this table of artefacts here that we've got, people may know the statue of Alfred outside Lincoln Cathedral. It's a photo here from 1905 of crowds of people gathered to see the unveiling of the statue, and again showing how big a figure he was, because there wasn't a green area before they wanted to put this statue up. What happened?
Well, actually, on the area where the statue now stands, there are a huddle of actually some of the medieval buildings, they're very old buildings, including the Dolphin's Inn, which was an old tavern, and all of that was cleared away to create the green on which the statue now stands.
So people literally paving over history in order to commemorate the celebrity of the day.
Yes, that's right.
Let's just have a wander back over to this end of the room. There's Tennyson's writing table over here. So he would have written on this, but he would have written using, of course, his hand. And we've got a cast of his hand here. Just tell me a little bit about the cast.
Well, it's a cast that was done in life, actually, and it's obvious left hand, actually. And as you can see, compared to my hand, he was a big chap, and it's a very, very large hand indeed. It's made out of bronze, so...
It's much bigger than my hand, and it's much bigger than your hand, and I suppose that gives a nature of the stature. You know, poets, we sometimes think of poets as being sort of quite quiet and unassuming people, but he was an imposing man.
Tennyson was quite a big, heavily built man, yes, yeah.
People say as a young man he was a very handsome, attractive man.
Yes, his wife certainly thought so, and he was very popular, yeah. I think the ladies quite liked him, yes.
Yeah. It's just fascinating to see a real cast of the man's hand, which seems odd, but it feels like he's kind of reaching through the centuries.
It's a popular exhibit, and people often remark on it, actually, yeah.
There are so many fascinating books here that, you know, whether it's first editions that have annotations from the poet, or there's Prince Albert's biography signed by Queen Victoria here, which was sent to Tennyson. And it seems odd to then focus on his hand, but it feels very tangible having a hand there.
The cast of his hand's got that immediacy, hasn't it? You can see, you know, the size and shape of his hand, you know, a physical reminder of what the poet was actually like, not just his works. So.
But we are surrounded by his work, and the archive it's a rare treat for people to come and visit it. But you can get in touch and ask to come and look, is that right?
Yes, that's fine, yeah. People are free to see his works actually within the search room downstairs, and we do open the library up from time to time for events and that sort of thing.
That's Adrian Wilkinson from the Lincolnshire Archives. Still to come, we have our Lincolnshire rapper reinterpreting Tennyson for a hip-hop audience. But now, let's head back to the birthplace of Tennyson, Somersby in the Lincolnshire Wolds, for a stroll with Debbie Jenner from the Tennyson Birthplace Society. Great, let's go for a walk then. So the brook that is mentioned in some of one of Tennyson's poems, the brook, that is just down the path here.
Down the lane here. It's a little walk down. It's actually known as various rivers as it goes, and it flows out to sea at Gibraltar Point in Skegness.
I suppose so. Anybody who has walked past the river in its various guises will now have a sort of slight connection to Tennyson, in that it was once had a poem.
Yeah, exactly. Well, a lot of people, when they go to Gibraltar Point, don't realise that it actually starts out here somewhere in the hills.
So we've just arrived at the brook, and we'll fold our way through some nettles and muddy riverbank. So it's quite a tranquil little place, isn't it? And you can see actually the date on the bridge looks like it's 1820s, I suppose.
It's 1827. It's the year that he went to Cambridge. So before that, it was a wooden bridge.
So there would have been a wooden bridge here. So Tennyson might have sat on this riverside, looking over a rickety wooden bridge that was then come back after going to Cambridge and feeling homesick, and found a brand spanking new old brick bridge, which is still standing today.
Yeah, well, the wooden bridge, apparently there are stories of him and his brothers and the other boys in the village sort of having Arthurian fights with swords defending the bridge, and it would have been here. There's probably a bridge somewhere, or would have been a bridge somewhere else as well, probably. But yeah, this is the bridge. This is Bridge Road. So
Unfortunately, you've conjured up images of Monty Python and the Holy Grail for me now, with the Black Knight who has all his arms and legs chopped off, defending the bridge.
Yeah. No, I don't think that was.
No.
I don't think that was the case. It was more romantic than that, I think.
Well, he certainly was inspired by Arthurian legends, and actually did a lot of research himself into Arthurian legends, didn't he? Because before he came along and wrote so many different. We think of Lady of Shalott, probably the most famous of one of Tennyson's poems, which talks about Camelot and Sir Lancelot and the Lady of Shalott, all rhyming, of course. He did a lot of research to find out and sort of put pen to paper to cement these legends into I suppose into the canon. Yeah,
well, his father had a vast library, part of which is actually at the research centre now, and so he was a very learned child. I mean, they were highly educated. I mean, they first of all started out with education here in the village in a cottage. Then Alfred was sent off to Louth Grammar School from his 7th birthday to his 11th birthday, and he hated it. But then he came home and his father schooled him and the other boys. And he was a very learned man, his father. The boys could quote Homer and all these classics, and could speak Hebrew and Greek and goodness knows what else. So, and Arthurian legends were, of course, I think everything that every little boy wanted to be a knight in shining armour. So, yeah, and I also have a sort of a little theory of my own that Old Bolingbroke's not far from here, and it's about the castle, well, the ruin. But actually, I found it's only about 7 miles to walk here as the crow flies, if you like. I found in a book an illustration of the castle in Tennyson's day, and there was actually still a tower standing. So to me, that is the inspiration for the castle in The Lady of Shalott. Might not have been, but who knows? We did walk around an awful lot, so and that's the only castle we had reasonably close. Tattershall's not. Well, it's a bit further away, but who knows? Maybe he was inspired by Old Bolingbroke Castle.
As we mentioned, the inspirational setting and the babbling brook here by our side. Would you care to recite some of Tennyson's work by the brook that we hope or guess has?
Well, if you don't mind losing a few listeners along the way, yes. I'll just do a little bit from the beginning and from the end because it's quite long. All right,
that's absolutely fine.
Right?
Yeah, go for it.
Okay, the brook. I come from haunts of coot and hern, and make a sudden sally, and sparkle out among the fern to bicker down a valley. By 30 hills I hurry down, or slip between the ridges, by 20 thorps, a little town, and 100 bridges, till last by Philip's farm I flow to join the brimming river, for men may come and men may go, but I go on forever. And then the ending is... I murmur under moon and stars in brambly wildernesses. I linger by my shingly bars. I loiter round my cresses. And out again I curve and flow to join the brimming river. For men may come and men may go, but I go on forever.
In a way, reciting it here it kind of gives it a kind of ethereal aspect, doesn't it?
It does. I mean, if you know the landscape and you know how it flows, yes, you can connect the two.
I don't think anyone who's listening would think that someone who lives in a setting as beautiful as this couldn't possibly be inspired. And even if it's sort of in the corner of their mind at the back to then write down many years later, I suppose your formative years are always become part of your inspiration.
They do. I mean, he spent the first 27 years of his life here, so it's a big chunk of his life. And yes, I mean, I live here, and I'm very lucky to live here, and I walk my dog a lot, and I walk around, and I feel inspired, not to write poetry, but it is very inspirational. It's very relaxing, and I can imagine this young child being inspired to be a poet. He always wanted to be a poet from a very early age, and he wanted to be a famous one as well, which luckily he became. Yeah, you can see that this countryside really did inspire him.
Hi, I'm Karen Edwards from East Lindsey District Council. I'm the Tourism Development Officer, so working on improving the area and as a tourist destination, attracting new visitors and raising the profile. You're
trying to encourage people to come to these places. I realise it's very difficult to, I suppose you can't really have busloads of people arriving in a small village like this with very little facility, but what sort of thing can you do to try and promote Tennyson as a Lincolnshire attraction, a Lincolnshire landmark in a way?
Well, a few years ago, when it was Tennyson's 200th anniversary, we produced a leaflet called On the Trail of Alfred Lord Tennyson, which explores Lincolnshire. It tells about his life from birth through to death, but it also includes connections that he had in Lincolnshire, so all the places that he had family, he had friends, and places he visited, places that inspired him. And this is all detailed in the leaflet, so people can come and they can discover this area for themselves in their own time, their own interpretation at many of these locations, and can walk in his footsteps essentially, and discover more about him, and maybe become inspired themselves.
I suppose the worry is that Tennyson was linked to so many different places like the Isle of Wight, and I suppose it must be quite hard to market something like that, because if you search for Tennyson or search for Tennyson Trail, you often come up with his poetry and some of the more famous places that he might have visited or lived.
Yeah, although this is where his roots are. This is what turned him into the poet he is. This is what gave him his inspiration, and many of his most famous poets were written when he was here. And we're doing a lot more to promote the Lincolnshire Wolds, and Tennyson's obviously a really important part of that. So in doing that, we're hoping that when people do search Tennyson, actually those links with Lincolnshire will become higher and higher profile, so they will come through, and then that will raise that awareness for people across. And it's not just this country, it's internationally. We get visitors here following Tennyson from all over the world, and so people are researching that. So we're hoping by the work that we're doing, it'll be more accessible to them to find that information.
Karen Edwards from East Lindsey's tourism team there, hoping that poetry will bring punters to the Wolds. And I must say, here's hoping that's the case. It's a lovely part of the county, and it's so inextricably linked with our celebrity poet, it'd be a shame if the efforts don't materialise. I spent so much of the programme talking about how much of a celebrity Tennyson was. Adrian Wilkinson from the Lincolnshire Archives earlier said that he was a Victorian superstar. Well, in the course of researching the programme, I heard this so often I needed some context. Just how big of a deal is he? It just so happens that on our doorstep is the University of Lincoln, and an expert who's literally written the book on Tennyson and the birth of photography. We arranged to meet up at a coffee bar at the university, which had been overrun by school children on a trip. So we decided to stroll up to the office.
It's nice to have got a coffee, but all these school kids I think will just drown us out slightly.
Yeah, no problem. We'll get
You see, this is a bit more quiet. I like the skeleton in the corner, that's nice.
Yeah, well, have a seat.
Thank you.
It's a bit low, that one.
Yeah, that's fine.
This is probably, I'm guessing, an 1880s print of the 1857 photograph. And you can see on the back, this is published by...
That's really very ornate, isn't it? The back of that photo.
That's right. This is a carte de visite, so this is the size of a visiting card. People would have albums and they would collect images of celebrities and they put them in these albums and they'd show them to their friends.
Almost like a precursor to those stickers you get of footballers and you put them in a photo album.
Yeah, you've got cigarette cards in the mid-20th century, and now we've got, Match Attax football cards or whatever, Pokemon cards. But people would collect these. And in fact, the commercial appeal of these was so wide, they had to bring out new copyright laws. And the first two photographs ever copyrighted are portraits of Tennyson. So that gives you some sort of sense that he's one of the big figures just at the time when photography is becoming a widespread technology. I'm Dr. Jim Cheshire. I work at the University of Lincoln. My job title is Reader in Cultural History, and I'm a Victorian specialist who's published quite a lot on Tennyson.
We talked a little bit about the phenomenon of Tennyson already, but I suppose a lot of people have this idea of Victorian poets and of them kind of being fusty and old and kind of not interesting. How would you convince someone to think that's not true?
In many ways, Tennyson was not typical. He was exceptional. No poet was even close to his commercial success in the Victorian period. No poet since Byron had so much exposure in the media. And so there are lots of things about Tennyson which are not typical at all. So if we look at Tennyson with a kind of unbiased perspective, there's quite a lot of contemporary preoccupations that we see him struggling with throughout his life. He's something of a publishing phenomenon. After the death of Byron in the 1820s, there's this sense that English poetry has almost sort of died out. When Tennyson starts to get famous, which is the late 1840s, there's a sense that this isn't just the start of a great poet's career. it's the start, it's the revival of English poetry itself. People are starting to talk about how well the books are selling, and reviewers of the book say this must be the most successful book of modern poetry, and at 7 shillings it's quite expensive. So when we think that Tennyson's first collection, they probably printed about 200 or 300 copies, and that never sold out. Selling 40, 50,000 copies of a poem in 6 months is quite a phenomenon. And by that time, the media coverage of Tennyson's popularity is enormous. So a review of Enoch Arden takes up most of page 3 of the Times in 1864. I think it's like Harry Potter in a way, because, something that's famous not just for what it is, but the scale with which it's actually being received. And obviously Tennyson wasn't quite Harry Potter, but there's an interesting sense of his cultural dominance in the mid-1860s, which is unprecedented. So we have a big cultural phenomenon that was talked about not just because of what the poetry said, but because of its success. And we get that kind of sense with that of Tennyson as a kind of celebrity author. And the other major factor when we're thinking of that is also not just the written word, but visual culture. The 1850s and 60s were probably the first decades where a significant proportion of the population might have seen a photographic portrait of themselves.
And I'd imagine it was probably, I can just guess that in the papers people say, oh, it's a terrible thing, we're all just obsessed with our own looks, in the same way that people are probably saying it now. Yeah,
there was this kind of worries that this would sort of stimulate narcissism. But on top of, if you like, ordinary people getting portraits made of themselves, people suddenly started to want photographs of famous people. And so we get a massive demand for portraiture in the mid-1850s, and that's really because of photography as a technology that's just appeared.
So that's like this book, this card that we've got here with the Tennyson on the front, and the kind of collectible cards, like the Pokemon cards we mentioned.
That's right, yes. And Tennyson is one of the first public figures to be recognised because of photography. And there's lots of anecdotes about Tennyson talks about cockneys peering over his hedge in the Isle of Wight. So he moved to the Isle of Wight to kind of get away from the crowds. But unfortunately, partly because Victoria and Albert built a home there as well, people started to come to the Isle of Wight to see Tennyson and Victoria and Albert. So people would come to his home and try and catch sight of the poet laureate. And there's nothing that could have prepared him for that, because no one had really had that experience before.
Nowadays, when people go on X Factor and so on, they really know what they're getting themselves into if they're to win this and go on for a successful career. There'd have almost been no one like in the history of the world ever who'd had a photo taken of him and then had the equivalent of the paparazzi following him all the time.
Yeah, I don't think people like Tennyson would have seen that coming. If we look at this big picture, if we take a step back, if you think of poets in the 18th century, they don't make money by selling loads of books. They need a patron, so you need a literary patron. So you need an aristocratic person who'll support you financially while you write your poetry, and you might deliver your poetry at one of their soirees. But you certainly don't make money by selling lots of poems. So Tennyson's one of the first authors to actually have the main source of their income from mass culture. So, in the 19th century, literacy is going up. The middle class is getting more wealthy. We have a mass market out there for culture for arguably the first time. And Tennyson's one of the first authors to actually, make most of his money from that mass market.
He's a fascinating character, and the reason I'm doing this, of course, is because he's from Lincolnshire, just down the road. And I, just as I came in, we're discussing Tennyson as being almost the biggest celebrity ever to have come from Lincolnshire. Is that a sort of fair assessment, do you think?
Well, I guess you could have a toss-up between Newton and Tennyson, maybe, depending on whether you're into science.
Yeah, I suppose Isaac Newton, Maggie Thatcher and Tennyson, I suppose.
Yeah. I mean, they're the kind of the big names, but certainly in terms of writing and the arts, I think Tennyson's there. And Lincolnshire was always with him, actually, because the other interesting thing about him is people often write about his personal appearance and his mannerisms. And because he had such an unusual childhood, he adored his father and his father adored him, but his father was, had serious mental health problems. And so, but he had a very rural, sheltered upbringing in many ways. And then when he suddenly became famous, this quite private man with this quite rural accent, Lincolnshire accent, was suddenly in these very sort of posh literary soirees in London. And there's a kind of shyness about him and this Lincolnshire accent, which made him seem a bit withdrawn. There are some contradictions between him being this national celebrity, but also having this kind of very rural upbringing as well.
I'm starting to think of him as being a kind of Darcy character from Pride and Prejudice, isn't it? A kind of tall, dark and handsome, very standoffish, but actually secretly boiling underneath is all this emotion and drama, I suppose.
Well, absolutely. I mean, you read the poetry, it's full of passion and feelings and emotions.
He's a fascinating character. Thanks for talking to me about him.
You're welcome, it's a pleasure.
Coming up next, Lincolnshire rapper OD reinterprets some of Tennyson's poetry to fit grime music.
BBC Radio
as
Lincolnshire.
Said, now for something completely different. We're in the BBC Introducing room at BBC Radio Lincolnshire, and I'm with Oliver David Cooper, whose stage name is OD. Now, Oliver, you're sort of an upcoming Lincolnshire-based rapper, and I've given you quite a difficult task. I've tasked you with the idea of rapping some of Alfred Lord Tennyson's poetry. First of all, how did you find it?
Well, when you come to me with the task, I thought, well, this is a bit out of the ordinary, and I weren't really sure how I was going to do it, looking at some of his poems, and I jotted a few down and, added the odd rhyming word, and before you know it, here I am performing it.
So you've adapted some of Tennyson's poetry, but how did you find? What did you think to the poems you looked into?
Yeah, well, that was really interesting. I mean, I didn't have to adapt them very much at all. They just sort of, fitted in with the grime instrumental that I used. So I didn't have to adapt them much at all, and I didn't adapt them in a way that took anything away from Tennyson's work.
Mm. And which poems did you use?
It was In Memoriam and...
Crossing the Bar, wasn't it?
That was the one, yeah.
In Memoriam and Crossing the Bar. Okay.
Yeah.
And you've kind of combined parts of In Memoriam and Crossing the Bar
to merged them into one.
To make your Tennyson rap.
Yeah.
Fantastic. Right, OD, I'll leave it to you. We're going to hear your rap.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much for doing this.
Ring out wild bells to the wild sky, the flying cloud and the frosty light. The year is dying, it's dying into the night. Ring out wild bells, so you better let them die. Ring out the old, ring in the new. Ring happy bells across the snow just for you. The year is going, so you better let him go. Ring out the false, ring in the true. Ring out the grief that saps the mind for those that we never ever see no more. Ring out the feud of the rich and poor. Ring in red rest for a dying cause, an ancient form of party strife. Ring in the nobler for different modes of life. Sweeter manners and purer laws tonight, right? Ring out the want, the care and the sin. Faithless coldness times we are in. Can you ring out all of my mournful rhymes? But you better believe, bring the minstrel in. Ring out the false pride inside place and blood. Civic slander and the spite despite. Ringing in the love of truth and right, whilst ringing in the common love of good tonight. Ring out old shapes of foul disease. Ring out the lust of gold for me. Ring out the 1,000 wars of old to be. And then you can ring in the 1,000 years of peace. Ring in the valiant man and the free. The larger heart, the kindlier hand. Ring out the darkness of all the land. Ring in the Christ that is to be. Sunset and evening star. One clear call for me. I mean, I've been a man, not about one up out to sea. But such a tide moving seems so sound asleep. Too full for sound and too full for foam. When that which drew me out the balance deep sends me home. When it sends me home.
So, first of all, thank you very much for trying and I think succeeding in turning Tennyson's poetry into something that hopefully people will realise that this poet who's been dead for 125 years now, that he's still relevant today. Did you find that in the lyrics?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, a lot of people who I've spoken to about told that I'm doing this show for Tennyson, and they all knew who he was and knew his work was profound, and yeah, I think it's great.
And I suppose over a century ago, this Lincolnshire man was writing this poetry, and now you're reinterpreting it. I suppose it shows the life and the sort of the lasting impact of that work.
Yeah, well, I'm sure he'd never think that his poetry would be on a grime beat. I mean, if he was to rise from the dead now,
I wonder what he'd think.
Yeah, I wonder what he'd think.
Hopefully he'd like it.
Yeah, hopefully.
And with that, we pretty much round off my special programme commemorating the 125th anniversary of the death of Alfred Lord Tennyson. I'll leave you with a bit more of the Tennyson concert with music by Lincoln composer Robert Stedman. This time the poem performed is Tears, Idle Tears, with Liz McIntosh singing the lyrics, Ruth Burkett on viola and Mark Perkins on the piano. Thank you for listening.
commemoration.